There is a language spoken in the mountains between France and Spain that no linguist has ever been able to place, not in the Indo-European family, which contains nearly every language on the continent, not in any Semitic branch, not in any Uralic or Turkic grouping. Euskara, the Basque language, stands completely alone, a linguistic island in the middle of one of the most thoroughly mapped linguistic landscapes on Earth. Scholars have been trying to connect it to something for over 2 centuries. They have failed consistently because there is nothing to connect it to. The language is older than the categories we use to sort languages. And for a long time, that fact was treated as a curiosity. Interesting, yes, significant perhaps, but ultimately just a footnote in the larger story of European history. Then the DNA arrived, and the footnote became the headline. The Basque people live in a region straddling the Western Pyrenees, the mountain range that separates the Iberian Peninsula from the rest of continental Europe. Their territory covers parts of northern Spain and southwestern France, a compact area of about 8,000 square miles. Roughly 3 million people identify as Basque today. They have their own regional government, their own cultural institutions, their own festivals and food traditions, and a sense of identity so distinct that a significant political movement spent decades fighting for full independence. The outside world knows them mostly through that conflict, or through their cuisine, or through the vague reputation for being fiercely proud of something outsiders struggle to fully define. What the outside world does not know, what the history books have largely failed to communicate, is what the genetics now make undeniable. The Basques are not simply a culturally distinct European minority. They are, in a very specific and measurable biological sense, a different kind of European altogether. They are the remnant, the living genetic archive of the people who were here first, before the waves of migration that built the Europe we recognize today ever arrived. The standard model of European prehistory goes like this. The continent was first populated by hunter-gatherers, who arrived from Africa via the Middle East roughly 40,000 to 45,000 years ago. They spread across Europe, developing the cave art traditions we find at Lascaux and Altamira, living in small mobile bands for tens of thousands of years. Then, around 8,000 to 9,000 years ago, a second wave arrived. Anatolian farmers from what is today Turkey brought agriculture into Europe, spreading westward and largely replacing the earlier hunter-gatherer populations as they went, and then between 5,000 and 4,500 years ago. A third wave, the Yamnaya pastoralists from the Pontic steppe, swept into Europe with horses and bronze, and a linguistic package that would become the ancestor of nearly every language spoken on the continent today. These 3 layers built modern Europe. Every European population alive today carries DNA from all 3 ancestral groups in varying proportions. Every European population, that is, except the Basques. When geneticists began sequencing ancient European DNA at scale in the early 2010s, they expected the Basques to follow the same pattern. What they found forced a significant rewriting of the European prehistory model. The Basques showed dramatically reduced steppe ancestry compared to every other Western European population tested. In some analyses, the steppe signal in Basque genomes was effectively absent. The massive genomic transformation that swept across Europe between 400 and 500 and 5,000 years ago, the one that gave most modern Europeans their Indo-European languages, had largely passed the Basques by. This was not a marginal finding. A 2015 study in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, followed by a landmark 2019 analysis in Science involving ancient genomes from across Iberia, made the picture clear. The Basques were the closest living genetic relatives of the Neolithic farmers who had inhabited the Iberian Peninsula before the steppe migration arrived. A population that elsewhere in Europe was transformed or displaced, but in the Pyrenean region survived with its genetic character largely intact. But here is where the story becomes genuinely strange. Because the Neolithic farmers themselves were not the original inhabitants of Europe. They were the second wave, which means the Basques are also carrying a signal of the first wave beneath that. The earliest European hunter-gatherers, the people who painted the caves at Altamira, the people who lived through the Ice Age in the forests of southwestern Europe, Their genetic signature flows more strongly through Basque DNA than through the DNA of virtually any other living European population. The Pyrenees were not simply a geographical feature. They were a barrier, and barriers in population genetics have consequences measured not in years, but in millennia. When the steppe pastoralists moved into Europe with their horses and their proto-languages, the populations in their path were largely replaced, not necessarily through violence, but through the compounding demographic pressure of a mobile, expansionist culture overwhelming more sedentary ones. Everywhere this wave arrived, it left a massive genetic footprint. Everywhere except the enclosed valleys and high passes of the Pyrenean region, where topography created a refuge and a refuge preserved what would otherwise have been erased. What survived in that refuge was not simply a population, it was a language. Euskara is now understood to be the last surviving descendant of the languages spoken by the pre-Indo-European inhabitants of Western Europe, languages swept away everywhere else by the steppe migration. When linguists say Euskara is a language isolate, they are saying it is a ghost, a voice from a world that was largely erased 4,500 years ago, still speaking through the mouths of people alive today. Consider what that means in human terms. For 4,500 years, while empires rose and fell, while Rome conquered and dissolved, while Christianity swept across the continent, while the Black Death killed a third of Europe's population, a small community in the Western Pyrenees continued speaking a language that predated all of it. They were invaded. They were nominally Romanized, nominally Christianized, incorporated into successive kingdoms and states, and through all of it, the language survived. The genetic signature survived, not by accident, by isolation, by the mountains, and by something harder to quantify, a fierce, persistent insistence on being what they had always been. A 2021 study published in Current Biology analyzed genomes from burial sites across northern Iberia spanning the Neolithic through the Iron Age and found something striking. While the rest of Europe was being genetically transformed, the population ancestral to the Basques maintained a stable genetic profile through period after period, in which everything around them was changing. This continuity was not just survival. It was resistance encoded in biology. There is a man living today in the town of Guernica who carries in his cells a mitochondrial haplogroup that traces back in an unbroken maternal line to the hunter-gatherers of Ice Age Europe. Not metaphorically. Not approximately. Literally, a genetic sequence passed from mother to daughter across tens of thousands of years, through the entire span of recorded history and deep into the prehistoric past, arriving intact in the present. He speaks a language that was ancient when Latin was young. He eats food prepared with techniques older than the Roman roads that still run through his region. He lives in a place his ancestors have occupied continuously for longer than the pyramids have stood, and none of the empires that crossed his ancestors' mountains, Roman, Visigoth, Moorish, Frankish, Castilian, managed to change that fundamental fact. The mountains gave his people time. Time is what biology needs to preserve itself. And preserve itself it did. The history books describe the Basques as mysterious, a people of unknown origin, a linguistic oddity, a cultural curiosity. What the DNA reveals is that this framing has the situation exactly backwards. The Basques are not the mystery. They are the answer to a mystery. The mystery is what happened to the rest of Europe, where the original populations went, why their languages vanished, why their genetic signatures were diluted almost to invisibility across the continent. The Basques did not emerge from obscurity. They are what Europe looked like before the transformations that created the Europe we know. They are the before picture in a story where everyone else has been looking only at the after. This matters beyond European history, beyond population genetics, beyond the academic disciplines that study these things. It matters because of what it tells us about identity and survival. The Basques are not what they are because of any inherent superiority or special providence. They are what they are because of mountains, because of geography that made them difficult to reach and therefore difficult to absorb. Because the same topographical accident that made their region economically marginal to successive empires made it a refuge for everything those empires would otherwise have erased. There is a deep irony in the fact that the most ancient population in Europe survived precisely because they were, for most of history, considered unimportant enough to leave alone. The question this raises is larger than one population in one mountain range. If the Basques retained this much, genetically, linguistically, culturally, across 4,500 years of pressure and transformation, what does that tell us about other populations whose ancient signals we have not yet learned to read? Across Europe, across every continent, there are communities whose distinctiveness has been explained away as cultural quirk or geographic accident. The genetics are beginning to suggest that some of these communities are doing what the Basques have always done, holding something old inside, something new preserving in their biology, and their language a continuity that the surface of history concealed. Ancient DNA is not just a tool for solving genealogical puzzles. It is a way of recovering what erasure left behind, of finding the signal beneath the noise, of hearing, however faintly, the voices of populations that history recorded as vanished, but that biology insists are still here. And yet here they are, speaking the oldest language in Europe, carrying the oldest genetic signal in Europe, living on the same land their ancestors occupied when woolly mammoths still walked the continent. The DNA did not discover the Basques. The Basques were never lost. What the DNA discovered is how much of the rest of us was. Every other population in Europe was transformed, linguistically, genetically, culturally, by the three great waves that shaped the continent. The Basques absorbed the pressure and held. That is not a small thing. That is one of the most remarkable acts of biological and cultural continuity in the recorded history of our species. History is not written in books. It is written in genomes. And sometimes, what the genome writes is not a story of conquest and replacement, but a story of endurance so quiet and so complete that the world forgot to notice it was happening. The Basques never forgot. They just kept speaking their impossible language in their mountain villages, carrying in their blood the record of a world that science is only now learning to read. The bones were always there. The language was always there. The mountains held the secret for 4,500 years, and now the DNA is finally telling us what the mountains always knew.